One big reason for a configurable infrastructure is having the tools to grow the system as the company grows and being able to do that without constant requests from some other department. So moving into our infrastructure demonstration, a lot of times you have many users, right? You have different types of users with different permissions to different applications, and you want functionality within those applications limited to just the role of the user. And so the way we do that is we go ahead and set up users within the system under the company menu. So I'm going to go over there. So let's say I want to create a user. I would go under, I could manage my users. I could go right over here and I could go to users, and I'm going to create a new user with this plus symbol on this left slide out menu. And within this user, I put some basic information about the user. I give them an ID that they'll use to log in, set their email address. These are important things. Everyone has to have a unique email address, a contact name. So that's related to their contact information, which might have phone numbers and address and different things we'd want to know about the user. And I set the user type. The business user is the full user. This is what you need to be to actually do accounting within the system, to be able to use accounts receivable and accounts payable and purchasing and order entry and different things like that. In the general ledger, you need to be a business user. But we also have other user types, which are less expensive users, like employee. And the employee user has a limited scope as to what they can do, but not what they can see. So you could actually let an employee user see all the customers, but not actually create or edit customer details. But you can let an employee user create purchase requisitions and do time and expenses. So those are the main things that an employee user would do. A project manager is if you're running the projects module, the project manager has more functionality within the project system. A platform user, if you're using your own application, so you can extend the Intacct system by creating platform applications, and platform users can use those applications without being a full business user and using all the standard accounting applications. CRM user is used to create users within the system that are actually users over in Salesforce, in your Salesforce CRM, and it allows them to interact with the integration that we have with Salesforce. We can give a user limited or full admin privileges. The main difference between those is that a full admin can create another admin, but a limited admin cannot. And then we have different statuses. So we could, rather than deleting a user, you would deactivate a user. If someone leaves the company, you would deactivate them. That way they'd still be available for all your past audit reports and audit trails and things. And then we have some rules around passwords and things. We also have their role information. This is really important because, as I'm going to show you, we deal with setting up users rather than setting up users with individual permissions, which you could do. You can just set up, you can ignore roles and set up users with individual permissions. You can set up roles for users. And that way you can set up all the permissions necessary for that role. And when another user comes on that's in a similar position, you can just assign that role to that person. Or you might assign multiple roles to a person. You can limit the entities that the user is allowed to use. Remember, I mentioned Drew Jackson that I'm logged in as. He's limited to just 2 of the 4 entities that we have in this organization. You can also set departments and territories for users, so they would report to a department manager. Jumping over to roles, I'm going to go ahead and leave here. This is a list of roles within this company or organization. If I look at AP Clerk here, I can see the subscriptions available to AP Clerk. These little check boxes mean that something is turned on within this application. So by seeing that I have a lot of empty check boxes, it means that this user doesn't have any permissions inside these other applications at this time. The only permissions for this user are in accounts payable, and I can click permissions to see what those are. So this is a full set of permissions for the accounts payable module for this user. And this user has the ability to list, add, edit, and delete vendors. They can see vendor groups and bills. They can deal with AP terms. And perhaps I want them to also be able to see summary, so I can create list and view for summary, but I don't want them to add, edit, or delete those. So you can really decide specifically what you want the user to do with each of these items. I can also limit the number of reports this user can see. They can run the AP ledger report. And maybe I've decided I want them to deal with aging, so I'm going to turn on the vendor aging reports and graphs so they can see that as well. Now, if I had a super user, I could go up in this corner and just click all. So I don't have to sit there clicking all these buttons. Or maybe I have an employee user that I want to be able to see everything within accounts payable. I could just click read only and it would change this. And if I wanted to clear the permissions, I could click none. So we have some shortcuts to make this easy to configure so you're not clicking a lot of buttons for every role that you set up. But once this role is set up, I can continue to use this role and assign it to different users. And I'm currently assigned to the subscriptions role. And you can see that that has access to the administrator subscription. And you can see that the administrator role has access to all the modules. And if we went to these permission menus, you would see that everything is checked. One thing that's limited for someone with limited access, as we saw when I jumped over to this tab for Drew Jackson, is that Drew doesn't even see the modules that he's not allowed to see. So it's not like he's going into a lot of areas and just seeing gray areas or things that are closed to him. We just removed them from the interface so that it's not cluttered up with things they don't need to see. You also have the ability to set up as many entities as you need. So moving back over to the company menu, we have entities here. And here's my 4 entities. So these are legal structures. There's locations within those entities, but those locations aren't entities themselves. Those are just different locations. I can set them up as individual legal entities if I want. The great thing about entities is that I can create inter-entity relationships between them. So as I create an entity or edit, and I'll go ahead and edit this first entity, you can see that I have an inter-entity setup, meaning I have a relationship and accounts for that relationship for receivables and payables between these different entities. And so I can account for bills within the entity. Let's say company 10 receives an invoice and they decide to have another company pay it for them. I can do that from the top level here. And then I can let Sage Intacct use the inter-entity relationship to make the journal entries automatically. So I'm not doing a bunch of inter-entity journal entries like you might be doing. So if you're running off of something like QuickBooks right now, where you've got every entity running under a different file, at the end of period, you've got to do a lot of journal entries to handle all the inter-entity transactions, who paid for what. The due to and due from reporting is based on those journal entries, and it's posted in a separate inter-entity journal. So this is going to make it easy to segregate those and reconcile at the end of the month. So as I mentioned, we have locations in addition to entities. So within this entity, I would have other locations, and we would set those locations up under that particular company. So if I jump over here to the San Francisco entity, just by clicking from this drop down, notice I get a new tab. So my top level tab is still available, but now I'm working directly in the San Francisco company or entity. And if I go to that company menu, I have locations within that, and I have 2 locations inside of that. And I can set up as many locations as I need. But they're running under one company, the San Francisco company. So you can kind of create this hierarchy, this parent-child relationship here. One way we help keep track of things. Also, I mentioned dimensions earlier. We have standard dimensions within a company. If I jump over to the general ledger, let's go ahead and close San Francisco for the moment. We'll go back to the top level. I'm going to go to the general ledger. And yes, I want to leave this menu. You noticed I wasn't finished editing that menu, so a little warning comes up so I don't lose what I'm working on. If I go over here to the general ledger, you'll notice I have a dimension structure with departments, employees, item, location, municipality, and here's one called patient. Now, patient isn't a custom dimension. What I've done in this case, because this is a healthcare company, I've changed the terminology within the company. And the way I did that was I went over to company. So here I am on the company menu, and I scroll down to this, right down under this setup area to this line terminology. When I go to terminology, it lists all my different available dimensions. So these are the standard names for these dimensions. Notice that class is the dimension that the system knows, the original name. I've changed the name to product line and product lines. And here customer, this is the one I just pointed out, has been changed to patient and patients, so that my system now recognizes, rather than class, which is very generic, as product line, customer as patients, And then these other ones I've left pretty much alone. But I can change the names on these standard dimensions to make them fit my way of doing business, to fit the company that they're in. And it makes it easy to move from an old solution to a new solution and to retain a lot of terms that you had in another solution. If you're migrating into Sage Intacct, you can simply set the terminology to match what you were doing before. The other thing we have within the infrastructure here that makes this so nice and allows us to do this top-level dashboard. Notice these are all, as I mentioned, roll-ups from across all these different locations, is that we have a shared chart of accounts. And what I mean by that is that I set the chart of accounts at the top level. And when I go into the general ledger and I go to my GL accounts, I've set this same chart of accounts at the top level with the, and notice they're natural numbers. I don't have a lot of extensions with the exception of these due to and due from entities regarding my inter-entity relationships. The system set these up, these dot 1, 2, 3, and 4. Other than that, we don't have any extensions on these. That's because Dimension is handling the function. So in another company, I might have, a different account for each, maybe I have an equipment account, 1500, and I have a different account for each, maybe a dash or a dot and an extension for each location. And then an extension beyond that for each department. I might have 3 or 4 extensions to this account number. And then I'm tripling and quadrupling my number of accounts in my chart of accounts. We've been able to simplify that with dimensions so that you have a smaller set of chart of accounts with natural numbers. And because this whole chart of accounts is shared and the rules are defined at the top level across the accounts, we can go ahead and establish any change that happens within any of the accounts is automatically rolled up to the top level. So if I'm over in the New York City entity in this company and I do business and I, create some transactions under accounts receivable and I receive a payment, that automatically gets rolled up and will show up on the dashboard in the assets as money received in my top level. We also share customers and vendors, or in this case, patients and vendors, across all the entities. And then we can also create restrictions on those to certain entities. So perhaps I want to create a top level list of patients, but I want to restrict them to certain entities. I can do that by looking at my patients. I can set this patient with restrictions to locations. And so I can go ahead and select this and I can choose which locations this patient happens to be restricted to, just the Atlanta location. And I'm done with that. And so I can go ahead and say, okay, this patient is available at the top level, so I can look at all the financials around this patient, but we can only do business at the Atlanta location because that's where this patient happens to reside. We can also do the same with vendors. This way we're looking at vendors from the top level. We can see where we're using vendors across multiple companies, and maybe we want to take advantage of bulk discounts. Rather than having a purchasing agent at each location, we start purchasing as a company and start getting better rates. We can keep track of purchases that come in and really track those at our main financial office. I have a question that's come in. It says, can you allow someone from a remote location, not part of the finance team, to add a purchase order? Sure. There could be a user with limited permissions, and then in the access log, you can track all the things that the user's done in the system. So everything that someone does is logged. With that, I hope I've shown you some of the infrastructure pieces and some of the configuration that you can do. So you're not going to need to go to IT to get things scripted, to configure things to match the way you want to do business. You can do that right inside the system, giving finance the control of running the financials according to the policies and the processes of your business.